So hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. If you're a long-time follower of the channel, you know it's been a while since my last video, but I'm really excited about today's topic because I think it's very important, and it's how to create a GraphQL project using Expo, GraphQL's Codegen, and TypeScript. So not only do you get GraphQL, you also get the full type safety that GraphQL provides. It's very powerful. To me, I think this is really important because pretty much every job I've had up to this point in my career, I've had to use GraphQL in some capacity. So it's a really good idea to know how to set all these things up because you'll probably need them at some point in your own work. At any point during this presentation, if you need to look at some sample code, or if you want to use my server, all of those links are in the description for GitHub, so you can grab all that stuff if you need it and do whatever you have to do there. Another thing to note really quickly is that I use a starter project here. So there's some UI layout for a to-do list. There's no real functional code there. Today what we're going to be doing is filling that sort of UI layout in with all the different queries so that you can see how everything works together with Expo and TypeScript and GraphQL and all that. But yeah, that's everything. I hope you guys found this tutorial useful. I hope you'll enjoy. Please like and subscribe, and let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, I wanted to give a really quick whiteboarding exercise where I give an overview of the architecture of this entire application. And of course, we begin with the GraphQL server. This is the root of everything we're going to do today. And in the description, I've actually linked the server that I'm using for today's exercise, and you can use that yourself if you like. The next important piece of this architecture is the client Codegen. And this creates all the TypeScript types for us at development time. But it does this based on the schema supplied by the GraphQL server. The next important piece of this architecture is the queries and mutations. So we'll say client query / mutation. And in order for this to work, it has to draw on two sources. It gets the actual data. It gets the actual data from the GraphQL server, but it gets its types from the client Codegen. The next thing we're going to consider is React hooks. And these are very useful in encapsulating our queries and mutations so that they're not only reusable, but it also keeps everything in one place. Doesn't seem like something we'd have to do much now, but once we get into the actual coding, it'll be very obvious why. So we'll say here encapsulates. Finally, we are going to have our component and this is the piece of the puzzle that actually consumes the data. Okay, so this is a high-level overview of our application. I'm going to refer back to this diagram at different times throughout the video, just so you can follow along with the mental model. But this is sort of the overview, just to get us started. Okay, so let's go about building something. And where we're going to start is this first part with the GraphQL server. I'm of course not going to code the GraphQL server in this presentation, but I'll leave a link to one in the description if you want to use it. It's written in Ruby on Rails, but you can of course just bring your own server if you so desire. So I'm going to quickly run my server on my local IP so that I have access to it using my Codegen. It's very important that you figure out your Wi-Fi local IP for your house so that you'll be able to do your development work. On the server, I have GraphQL, and as you can see, I have some queries kind of already lined up for later. I'm not going to use those right now, but GraphQL is a really great tool. I recommend using it for kind of messing around and figuring things out when you need it. Okay, so where we're actually going to do some coding now is this client Codegen part, which is the next part that we're going to do. And this is where we're actually going to generate all the different GraphQL types that we need in order to get things working. So let's start by installing some dependencies. First dependency we're going to need is, of course, Apollo Client. And we'll give that a second to install. And the next thing we're going to need is a few different dev dependencies. Of course, being our Codegen, the CLI for it, the client preset, and this parcel watcher is what's going to allow us to be able to sort of hot reload our types as we read our code. It'll all make sense a little bit later. Okay, so the next part we need to do is we need to create a file called codegen.ts. And I promise I'm going to get into some actual live coding, but I do have to copy paste another thing. And this is the configuration file. And here you insert your local IP into the schema location. And I'm going to grab that from here. And other than that, this is really the kind of thing you set up pretty much only once and you don't touch it again. So I didn't want to live code it and waste a bunch of people's time. Something just to keep in mind is this generates block here. It will generate all the code in the directory you specify. And in our case, it's going to be src generated once everything's ready to go. So in the package.json now, I'm going to add a couple of scripts. And these are just going to run the Codegen when we need that. All right, so really quickly before we move on, I'm just going to remove this space because that would have caused problems. And the next thing I'm going to do is add Apollo Client to the project. So actually not just install the library, but connect it up. And in order to do that, we're going to import the Apollo Client along with the Apollo provider and the in-memory cache. At this point, we need to actually make the client. Whoa. And we need to configure it a little bit. First, we're going to give it a URI that matches the one that we used for our Codegen. And after that, we're going to create a new in-memory cache to use as the apps cache. Last thing we need to do in order to hook things up, Apollo provider, is wrap the app in the provider. And use the client in order to do that. All right, so in order to make sure this all works, we're gonna run a command really quickly. It's gonna be yarn run compile, and this is gonna try and compile all the GraphQL types for us. Obviously there won't be any types because we don't have any queries yet. I just wanna make sure that everything's connected up. And as you can see, the application has already started generating types. You might see some errors there because you don't have any queries, but those will resolve themselves as we kind of go along. Okay, so at this point, we've kind of covered the first two bits, right? We have our GraphQL server, we have our client Codegen, but for this last bit, really these three things, the queries, the component, and the React hooks, all kind of interact with each other in an iterative fashion. You're gonna see what we're gonna do every time we need a new query is we're gonna add it to the app. That's gonna cause the Codegen to fire. And we're going to wrap that query in a React hook. And then we're going to use the React hook in the component at the end. And we're just going to do this over and over and over again until our application is completed in the step and in the way that we want. So as you can see off to the side here, I've already compiled the Android app. Right now, I am not querying anything. This is literally just a placeholder data. And what we're gonna do now is we're gonna actually we're gonna create the queries, and we're gonna try to build up this app. The first thing we're gonna do is we're going to query all of the to-dos for a given author and display them in our mobile app here. Okay, so now that we have all that initial stuff ready, the next thing that we'll want to do is create a new folder, and we will call this new folder hooks. Inside of hooks, we're going to add the file for our first GraphQL query, and that is going to be called useTodosByAuthor. So the reason we put it in a hook is because it makes it more reusable, and we can co-locate the query and all the different state we use to manage the query in one place. You could technically just use a bunch of one-off queries everywhere, but it would get really tedious really fast and really hard to maintain. So the first thing we want to do is import useQuery from Apollo client. We'll also want to import GraphQL from our generated file. Next thing we're going to want to do is actually put the string for the GraphQL query here. So I'm going to say getTodosForAuthor. And I'm going to make it equal to GraphQL. And for the query, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into here, our graphical, and I'm going to run it to make sure it works, and it does. So I'll copy my getTodosForAuthor into here and paste it. And as soon as I hit save, we should probably see, oh, no code's getting generated yet, probably because I didn't use it. Okay, so let me actually use this. So I'll say export const useTodosByAuthor. And it here, I'm gonna get a result. And that's gonna be the result of doing useQuery on this. And actually, if I hit save now, I think I'll get it. Oh, you know why I'm not getting it? I have to do yarn run watch, and this will watch all of my code for changes. And as soon as there's actual code changes, the type generates. So if I look in here now, you see my GraphQL query getTodosForAuthor, and the types are actually generated and will work. Okay, so if I go in here and I set my variables, I need only one, that's ID. And I'm going to let the caller pass that in. Then I'm just gonna return the results in the end. Oh, I don't need these brackets. Whoops. Okay, and that should be ready for consumption in the main component. Okay, so actually using our hook is quite easy. First thing I'm gonna do is go back to the home screen and just delete the mock data. Now what we're gonna do is we're going to import and use our hook. So we're gonna say useTodosByAuthor, and I'm just gonna hard code the ID to 1. The ID is of course the user ID, and you could use a token, but today we're not really dealing with authentication, so I'm not going to worry about that. And I'm gonna grab the data, the loading state if you want to use it. You can also grab the error and the refetch method if you so require. So now, inside of my flat list, I'm going to put data.getTodosForAuthor, and that should query all the data, and you see that of course it does. So we're off to a good start here. Okay, so queries are really great and all, but a lot of times just a query isn't enough, and you want to share little pieces of queries with other ones. And these little pieces are called fragments. And I'm going to show you how to refactor this next part so that instead of specifying all these things manually, we can actually just use a fragment. Quickly, let me go into graphical and kind of show you what that looks like. So right now you see we have our get-to-dos for author and it has all this different stuff. What we can do instead is do this ... essentials. And that will allow us to query the exact same thing, but with this little fragment chunk that can be used in other queries and mutations as well. So let's quickly go over how we set up fragments in our GraphQL application. So inside the hooks folder, we create a new file, and I'm just going to call this file fragments. You can call it whatever you want, but it's just an easy name for me. We're going to then import the GQL from generated again. And I'm going to create a fragment called the essentials fragment. That is, of course, also going to be a GQL value. And I'm going to copy paste my fragment from graphical really quickly. Okay, this time I don't really need to wrap anything because it's not a hook or anything like that. But what I do need to be able to do is register my fragment so that the application knows that I can use it. And to do that, we have to go to our in-memory cache. And we want to change the fragments property. But in order to do that, we have to have a fragments registry. And the fragments registry is where all the fragments are stored so that you can use them wherever you want in your application. So I'm going to import create fragment registry from the Apollo client cache. I'm going to throw it in here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my essentials fragment in there. And at this point, what we can do is in here, we can say we want ... essentials instead of wherever we had before. And if I reload the app, whoops, we should see that the query still works, and it does, which is really good. Okay, let's move on to mutations now. All right, so the first mutation that we're going to make is one that actually creates the to-do. As you're obviously aware, mutations are really important in any data-driven application, and they're pretty much useless without the ability to mutate the data that you create. So let's call our first hook here useCreateTodoForAuthor. Inside here, we're going to import useMutation, which is of course a hook from Apollo client. We're also going to import our generated GQL file because that has all of our type information. I'm going to then give us a constant here. And I'm going to grab our query from graphical, but really quickly, I just want to show it to you in action. So here's our CreateTodoForAuthor mutation in graphical. As you can see, it has all the different information that we need there. And let me just quickly plug in some variables. So I'll say title, it's going to be hello world. Our message for the to-do is going to be get milk. And the author ID is going to be author ID 1, because that's the author we've been working with up until this point. So I'll run CreateTodoForAuthor, and as you can see, it creates the to-do. And if I do getTodosForAuthor, whoops, I created the same to-do twice. But anyway, you'll see now that the to-do is on the author just like this. Okay, so let me grab this mutation and I will throw it into here, which makes it now usable. And I can create the actual hooks. So export const useCreateTodo. This is going to take in the author ID. And now we get into a little bit wonky syntax, But when you use useMutation, actually I should probably just do this first. When you use useMutation, there's a few different pieces to it. The first gives you back a callback to do the actual mutation you want to do. The second argument gives you back all the different states of the mutation. So this is like loading and the error and the data and whatever else, which is comes in handy. But right now what we're going to do is wrap this method a little bit so that it makes it a little easier on the caller to use it. So I'm going to make a method, create new to do. I'm going to make it async so that we're able to await on it. It's going to take in a title and a message for the to-do. And in here, we're going to use our create to do. And in here, we're going to specify our variables. You always have to do that. It's really hard to remember, but and in here we're going to put our title, our message, and our author ID. And from this hook, we're going to return our create new to do function that we created for convenience. We'll also return the loading, error, and data just in case we need them from the caller. And as you can see, if I hover over this, we've got full type safety. It was all inferred automatically from Apollo with our generated GQL thing. I know you probably already know that. It's just nice to repeat it a little bit so that we can continue to get it in our memory. All right, let's go use this on the home screen. All right, so to get this to work is actually also quite easy. What you first do is you go into create to do, and we can say that, whoops, actually, let's not start there. First thing we have to do is we actually have to get the value from our hook. So we can say use create to do, and we're going to do it for author ID 1 again. We're going to get our create new to do method from useCreateTodo, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add this to our create to do function, and we'll pass the title in from here and the message, and then what we're going to do is we're going to call the refetch method for useTodosByAuthor. So that after we create the to-do, the page will reload with the new author that we just created. Something to keep in mind really quickly, this create to-do is just passed into a custom modal I created. You don't have to worry too much about that. All you need to know is that when I actually hit the button, this is the method that's called. It creates the to-do, hides the modal, and refetches the data. So let's try this out to see if it worked. I'll call this one hello. I'll just use HHHHH just because it's easier. You'd obviously make a more normal to do if you're going to create one, but we're just testing if this works. So now if I click create, you see that right here, our to do comes in, and we're ready for the final step, which is updating data and actually marking these to dos as completed. All right, so the last thing we're going to actually do is mark a to-do as complete. And as usual, let's start in our graphical playground, and we'll use that in order to see this work. So as you can see, for our author here, we had the two identical to-dos. I'm going to mark just the one with ID 10 as completed true, just to show that this works. So you can see I have my mutation here. Author ID, of course, stays as 1. The to-do ID is going to be 10 because this is the one I want to change. And the completed status is going to be true. So let's run that, and we get a nice response. And if we get to-dos for our author, we can see that our to-do ID 10 was marked as true, so we can be confident that complete to-do works. So I'm going to grab this really quick, and then I'm going to paste it in a minute. But what we're going to do next is we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it useCompleteTodo, because this is where we're actually going to complete it. As usual, we're going to import our useMutation from the GraphQL client. We're going to import also GraphQL from our generated file. we're gonna have our complete to do here in our usual function, and I'll paste it in. Oh, and heads up, by the way, you can see that our to-do is actually filled in here after I hot reloaded, which is kind of nice. Taste of things to come. But anyway, let's continue. So we're gonna make a function now. A hook. We're gonna call it useCompleteTodo. As usual, it's gonna take in the author ID. And just like before, we're gonna use a mutation. Remember that the first thing you grab is the actual functionality. The second thing you grab is sort of everything else related to the to-do. So we're gonna do use mutation, complete to-do. And so I'm gonna create another helper. I'm gonna call it mark to-do as complete. And in here, we're gonna take in a to-do ID, which is a string, a completed value, which is gonna be a Boolean. And so inside of here, we're gonna call this complete to do. And our variables are going to have the author ID, the to-do ID, and the completed status that we pass in. Finally, in our return, I'm gonna give it back the mark to do is complete, and I'm also gonna throw in these values just as a bonus. Okay, so let's finish things up. Back in the home screen, we are going to get our useCompleteTodo. We're gonna have author ID 1, and we're gonna grab our mark to do as complete method. Down in the flat list, we're gonna create a new method that we're gonna use to actually mark things as complete. And here, this is gonna take in the item, and that item is going to have the ID. And then the second thing we're gonna do is we're going to mark the completed value as the opposite of whatever it is now. By the way, you see we get autocomplete, kind of just further proving that our types in TypeScript are working, which is really cool. So we just plug that on press into the on press, and I'm gonna quickly just reload the app here, and let's make sure that works. So if I click on the milk, you see it gets marked or unmarked. So far, so good. And let's get even crazy here. Let's check GraphQL to make sure it's working in here. If we get to-dos for author 1, and we want to mark the Broly Bana to true, if I click on them and then I reload this, you see it's true. So all of the state from the client GraphQL is synced up with the server, which is really cool, guys. All right, so that's everything I had. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, happy hacking.